Hi, welcome to the Russ Show, where I deliver content intended to inspire, educate, and motivate. Engage with me online at lruss.com and on social media. Enjoy the show. Today, my guest is Cynthia Thurlow. She's the author of Intermittent Fasting Transformation, a 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. She's also a nurse practitioner, CEO, and founder of the Everyday Wellness Project, and a podcaster. She has international speaking experience and 9.6 million views for her second TEDx talk, Intermittent Fasting, Transformational Technique. Visit cynthiathurlow.com to learn more and enjoy the show. Hey, Cynthia, welcome.
Thanks so much. I've been looking forward to connecting with you again.
Well, I love all the work that you're doing, and specifically this new book we have here. Let's talk about it. But before we get into the details of the book, this 45-day program, let's chat about, again, give us your story. You are a nurse practitioner, and so obviously you were led into the health field. But then what had you jump further into this arena of fasting and health, intermittent metabolic flexibility and health?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for listeners that are not familiar with my background, I'm a traditionally trained allopathic medicine NP, worked in cardiology for 16 years. Prior to that, I was an ER nurse. I'm an adrenaline junkie. But I think when I had my first child and he had some eczema issues, some significant food allergies, that really started this journey into looking at the interrelationship between nutrition and health. And so this is a very different focus than what traditional allopathic medicine is. And so I kind of dove down this rabbit hole, reading, understanding. Of course, I was paranoid to take my now 16-year-old as an infant, paranoid to take him anywhere, realizing he had these life-threatening food allergies. And so I spent, 2 years of my life making every single thing from scratch because I was just so concerned he would have food that would be contaminated. I was concerned about taking him to restaurants, even, well-meaning family and friends that don't really understand food allergies from a physiologic perspective. It can be quite frightening, especially to see a child in anaphylactic shock. And so that really started my journey to look at medicine and preventative health really differently. And so it started with, started a PhD program, which I hated. I did a wellness coaching program, which I was kind of like, meh. And then I read a book called Eat the Yolks. And the author, had this really refreshing perspective, very different than what I'd learned as a nurse or a nurse practitioner rather. And I reached out to her and said, where did you get your training? It's really unique. And this really resonates with, how I think about food. And so she told me about this functional nutrition program. I dove down that rabbit hole. That lit me up. And so it made it increasingly more challenging to go to work every day and write 1 prescription, 2 prescriptions, 5 prescriptions, 10 on every single patient, because the traditional allopathic medicine model is we wait till you have a symptom and then we treat the symptom. And that's what we've conditioned our patients to believe. And I woke up in 2016 with no business plan, looked at my husband and said, I can't do this anymore. And my husband, who's a very fiscally conservative, very responsible individual, was like, what? What do you mean you're going to leave this well-paying nurse practitioner job? And so I gave my place of occupation notice, and they graciously offered me everything under the sun to keep me. And I jumped into the entrepreneurial space. And so nearly instantaneously, I started attracting exactly the kind of woman that I myself was experiencing. So I was in perimenopause, the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. I was tired. I was gaining weight. And no woman wants to deal with weight loss resistance. I was developing underlying food sensitivities. My thyroid went in the toilet. The list goes on and on and on. But most significantly, I had no energy, and I knew I wasn't depressed, and I didn't want to be this person. And so this voyage of self-discovery / entrepreneurial spirit led myself to really serving women in middle age. And that got me into fasting. Someone had recommended that I consider it. In my typical fashion, I'm very much I have to get the data and the research and look at it and then make a decision. And in my research and my data collection, I ran across Jason Fung's book, and I thought to myself,
he's so great.
Oh, he's amazing. And I thought to myself, his book changed my life along with a few other books. And I really dove headfirst, and almost instantaneously, I felt better. I had more energy. I was sleeping better. I started to lose weight. And when you're 5'3", 5 to 10 pounds does make a difference. I just want to be really clear about that.
Oh my gosh. Hi, fellow short lady. I'm
Yes.
5'2".
Oh, yeah. So, you seem so much taller. I always say
so do you in your pictures. And I'm sure you get this all the time. And when people meet me in
Yes.
person, they're like, oh my God, I thought you were like 6 feet tall.
Yeah, no. People are almost always disappointed because they assume I'm like 5'8", 5'9". And I say, I'm a very tall presence person.
There you go.
But yeah.
No, but when you're short, it's especially frustrating.
Yes, it is. And it was all in the areas I didn't want it to be. And so,
Yeah, why can't it just go right to the boobs?
Exactly.
No.
Exactly. That would be fair as opposed to on my butt and my stomach. And so that it opened up my eyes. And then I started talking to my patients about it and my clients, and the whole ironic situation. And getting back to your original question is that in 2018, I'm also an introvert, which people are oftentimes very surprised to hear. I wanted to challenge myself. And so I was like, what would be a big, scary goal, amongst my growing business, which was actually doing quite well, not having had a business plan, which is pretty amazing. I decided I wanted to do a TED Talk because that seemed like a big, scary thing. I'll get on stage. I have to commit something to memory. That will be scary for me in front of people I don't know. And so in 2018, sent off a bunch of applications. And I want to tell you how many were sent, 80, till I got one offer. And then I got a second offer very soon afterwards. And for listeners who may not know the whole process, you can't do a TED Talk about the same topic. So I had to come up very quickly with a second topic. And I looked at my husband and I said, what do I know a lot about? And he was like, intermittent fasting. And that's as easily as the decision was made to do the second talk on intermittent fasting. And so obviously, did the first talk about perimenopause, and I was completely like embarrassed, all this age shaming. I can't, like, I say it now and I laugh about it, but we are a very ageist society. And I think in many ways, getting up on stage and talking about what was happening to my body and being a nurse practitioner, having had no preparation for what was going to happen, this reverse puberty situation. And then, which is really what happens to us.
Yeah.
And then a couple months later, I do a second talk after being hospitalized for a long time. So, for me, I look at fasting as something that saved me intellectually, mentally, and physically. And then it's the way our bodies are really conditioned to thrive. We're not meant to eat so frequently. And that's the common misnomer in the United States, is that people have been conditioned to believe that meal frequency is important, and mini meals and snacks and stoking our metabolism. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. And so I'm on a mission to help change people's perception of metabolic flexibility and what that really represents. Because if we as a society continue on our current trajectory, we are going to be the most unhealthy population of adults we've ever had. And that to me is unacceptable.
It absolutely is. And it's really, type 2 diabetes is just such an epidemic all over the place and in our country. You mentioned a couple of things there before we get into the actual ins and outs of fasting and why it's important and all the things that go on and how to do it. I just want to highlight a couple of things you mentioned. First, turning to your husband and being like, I can't do it anymore. I'm going to start on. Now, first of all, so like, yeah, how you like me now, husband? His? He must be like, oh my God.
I think he panicked. I'll be honest with you. Like, now that I've become successful in this venue, he's very proud. I could not be more proud of me. Yes. But there was a solid year where I think he thought I had lost my mind. Like, he would talk about it like it was my hobby. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to be successful.
See, and I love that. That's such confidence. And that's what I want to highlight is you're like, no, I'm doing it. I'm declaring it. And then I love the fact that you said, you know what, this is obviously such a great skill. You mentioning that you're an introvert and saying, what's a scary thing I could do? That's again, it's so interesting because it's such a high level of confidence within someone who may not feel that in the moment, but wants to or thinks they should. I just want to highlight that, what incredible confidence and what a great example of just, hey, what's something that's tough that I want to do or need to do for my business, even, which you did. You had to do that to become successful.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other piece is, for me, on so many levels, I felt so called to do those talks. Like, it was as if I had to do those talks. I mean, I wanted to do them, but whether it was an energetic shift, there was something that the universe was calling to me and saying, this is going to manifest. And even when I was in the hospital and I was very sick, my two thoughts were focused on my children, getting home to them and making sure they knew I was going to be okay. And number two, I was like, I'm doing this talk. And the organizers of TEDx Greenville, I'm sure thought I was insane, because when I got out and they wanted to do a video call to make sure I didn't die. And they kept saying, we don't want you to feel pressured. And I was like, I don't feel pressured. I can do this. I can be ready to do this in 2 weeks. And they were like, okay. And I said,
you're like, I'll do a speech on intermittent dying.
Right. Exactly. And then, it's interesting. Had I not had the experience 3 months before, I wouldn't have felt confident enough to know that I could pull myself together in a week and commit something to memory. And, anytime you do a talk where you don't have the ability to have a teleprompter or notes or anything, and you have to commit it to memory, it's a very different kind of thought process and how you learn it, and how it literally becomes everything you do when you're driving in your car, when you're showering, when you're sleeping. You're doing nothing but running that dialogue in your brain. So it's a fascinating psychological experiment. Really, it says a lot about the individual. Like, if you can manifest it, get up there, execute it, get off the stage and go, okay, I did a pretty good job.
Absolutely. No, I just love that so much. And again, that is what really brought you to the forefront and in people's minds to go, oh, this is what this is. So most people think about fasting. They think about either water fasting or doing that cleanse with the cayenne pepper, the lemon juice, and the maple syrup, right? The master cleanse. And then most people nowadays understand that intermittent fasting is, most of the day you're not eating, and then there's like a window. But for people that don't understand what intermittent fasting is, and there's different ways people do it, can you just sort of tell us what it is and then the different ways that people adopt it?
Yeah. And that's a great question. I say it's as simple as eating less often. And so that can manifest in very different ways. I think the most common feasting schedule is usually a 16-8. So 16 hours fasted with an 8-hour feeding window. I think that's very accessible for a lot of people. You will see people that will do OMAD, which is 1 meal a day. They might have a very, very narrow feeding window. That's obviously not my favorite choice for women in particular. There are people who just do 1 24-hour fast a week. There are people who only fast 2 days a week. But I think when we're thinking about the most popular strategies when it comes to fasting, I think the 16-8 is probably what most people are most familiarized with. And then there are all these nuances. I always say it's kind of like you learn the basics and then you move on to more advanced strategies. And that's the longer fast, the more intricate fast. There are a lot of people that do dry fasting, which I'm not a huge proponent of. I like people to be hydrated while they're fasting.
So dry fasting, for those that you don't know, is literally not having any water as well, or food.
And I think for me, coming from a cardiology background, I think about dehydration. And so I think that's, most people are chronically dehydrated. And so that's not my favorite strategy, although, I know the intrinsic benefits, based on research that I've read and colleagues that use that as a different variation of fasting, but generally not my favorite one, largely because between the amount of processed foods the average person eats and the lack of hydration most people have in their day, if you're already chronically dehydrated, the last thing you want to do is just not drink any fluids for a day or two. I think that sets people up for having all sorts of challenging symptoms like dizziness and headaches and lightheadedness and the things that come from that, palpitations, and sometimes people have sleep disturbances. And so I don't know about you, but I enjoy drinking water throughout the day. That would be it's actually be more challenging not to drink water than it would be to not eat food.
Absolutely. And for those that don't know, when you say 16-8, usually it means 16 hours of not eating, right? And then there's 8 of eating. So what that looks like in a lot of people's days is maybe not eating till 12 and then having a window between 12 and 8 p.m. Now,
correct.
Well, let's talk about that window for a minute. So at least as I understand it, and I wonder how targeted and detailed this gets, but for me anyway, like when I usually have like a 6-hour window, I'll eat whenever I feel like in that window.
Exactly. And I would imagine you are probably very connected to your body. You recognize true intrinsic hunger. I think on many ways, we as a society, because of the meal frequency, there was a great study done by Sachin Panda last year that was looking at meal frequency, and people could report their meal frequency in this app. So it makes it super easy. And there were people who were eating upwards of 10 times a day. And I remind people that when you're eating without thought process, like you just say, I'm conditioned to eat breakfast at 8, and then I eat lunch at 1, and then I eat dinner at 7, and then at 8 o'clock I have a snack, and then maybe I have a drink at 10. you're oftentimes not even connected to the true intrinsic properties of hunger. And I find for many people, they're generally not even hungry when they get up. I mean, maybe my teenage boys are. In fact, they're like very fixated on food in the morning, but they're growing and that's different. But for the adults that are out there, I think in many, many ways, there's this disconnect from our bodies. And I truly believe that fasting gets us connected deeply back to the process of observing cues that our body is providing to us and responding to them. Because sometimes your stomach growling is not really about hunger. It's oftentimes that you're dehydrated and you need water. And so hunger can be a cyclical symptom that people can experience, but it isn't always a sign that you necessarily need food. Like I know how my body feels if I've done a heavy lifting day and I'm really, really hungry when I get home. I'm like, okay, maybe today I break my fast at 10 and my feeding window is 10 to 6. Maybe there's a day where I'm not as active in the morning and 12 to 8 works. And that's the beauty, is that you can move that arbitrary 8-hour, 6-hour window around based on your needs, vacation, your travel plans, whatever's going on. And so I think for many, many people, they see it as being a rigid thing. And I just remind them, the only thing that I'm oftentimes rigid about is I want people to understand the basics before they start creating all these variations. Like it's almost like the bright, shiny object, the people out there like, I only do OMAD. And I'm like, that is fascinating. I don't know how you get enough macros in a 4-hour feeding window, but knock yourself out.
Right. Yeah. And also goes back to just, my work with Mark Sisson and primal blueprint and all of that, which is eat when you're hungry and trying to be more intuitive, which you get as you get healthier and more metabolically flexible, right? You get more in tune. And so, like you said, you have to naturally switch it up. There are some times where I've like woken up at 4 a.m. because there's like a peacock honking out my window and now I'm up. So then I'm kind of bummed because I'm like, I know this is going to throw off my food the way I want it to be, but I don't fight against it, because when I'm hungry now, then at that point at 11, I will honor it. Even though I may like mentally be not happy about this change, I do it anyway. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm following that rhythm. I'm not saying, no, I'm a person that doesn't eat until 2. I have to wait. I just go, well, my day got screwed up and now I'm hungry, so I'm doing it.
But I think that's really key, is that
too many people identify so rigidly with something.
Well, and I think most people don't get woken up from a peacock. I mean, that's a pretty cool, that's a pretty cool way to wake up.
One time it was a mountain lion. Not such a cool morning. No, but I mean, I think people, like you said, it's part of the fun of this, I think, is getting more in tune with yourself.
Yes. And for many people, they're really disconnected. I had a really pleasant conversation earlier this week with a podcast host who does not fast. And she was explaining why. And I thought she did such a beautiful job explaining why fasting would not work for her, given the fact she had a disordered relationship with food. And she's finally has a healthy relationship with food and doesn't want restrictions. And I said, and that's okay. Like, it is okay if you are in a position in your life and you're like, this would not work for me. Like, whether, there's women out there that are pregnant or breastfeeding, or people that are, just coming out of the hospital. You better believe when I left the hospital in March of 2019, 15 pounds lighter than I normally am, I didn't fast for a long time because I just wasn't at a healthy weight and I couldn't manage or mitigate my blood sugar. And so I think in many, many levels that, there may be seasons to doing intermittent fasting, meaning, certain times in your life, it may not be appropriate, and that is totally okay.
Tell us why fasting is beneficial. Like why that 16 hours? Why would I choose that model over the 3 meals a day or the 3 meals and 2 snacks? Why am I choosing that? What's the point of 16 hours of not eating? Why is that benefiting me?
Well, and I think it's really important for people to understand that the bulk of our westernized society is metabolically unhealthy. And what that represents is that there's a degree of insulin resistance, and insulin is not a bad hormone. Insulin is a beautiful hormone, but when it's not properly regulated, it creates a cascade of health problems. And nearly any chronic disease that we see, high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancer, gout, et cetera, are all mitigated by insulin resistance. So the way to help manage insulin properly, insulin is secreted in response to our blood sugar going up. That's how it's supposed to work. And if we are eating all the time, our insulin levels don't ever get an opportunity to be at a lower level. And if they're not at a lower level, guess what? We don't get to tap into fat stores for energy. Jason Fung does this beautiful analogy, which I can't take credit for. But if you think of our bodies as a refrigerator, we have to clear out the refrigerator before we can get to the freezer. And the freezer is the fat. Our body will readily utilize carbohydrates for energy, and it takes a little bit longer to get to the freezer. And so I like to remind people that when we are not eating, insulin levels are lower. Our body has the ability to draw on these stored fat stores for energy utilization. And here's something that a lot of people don't realize. When we are metabolically flexible, meaning that our body can switch between using carbohydrates and fatty acids for fuel, it's a beautiful thing. Our brains, as one example, they love fats. So when we break down fats into fatty acids, and there's one that breaks down to a specific type of ketone, it's called beta hydroxybutyrate. It diffuses right across the blood-brain barrier. So one of the first things people will say when they start fasting is they have mental clarity. The reason why they have mental clarity, insulin levels are low, and this beautiful diffusion of this specific type of ketone is right across the blood-brain barrier, and it allows our bodies to be fueled predominantly by fat. So we have sustained energy. We lose weight more readily. We have stable energy levels. Like, we aren't crashing. We don't become hangry. We're not struggling with energy issues. And so if you talk to people that are eating with meal frequency of 2 to 3 meals a day with snacks in between and snacks after dinner, they have energy problems. They get hungry very frequently. They're not hungry 4 to 5 hours later. They are hungry 1 to 2 hours later. So their body is overtaxed. They are never giving their body a break from digestion. And there's even this really cool mechanism in the gut called the migrating motor complex. And this is an oversimplification, but it's a way that your body kind of pushes food forward, helps detoxify and get rid of pathogens and things that don't belong. But it takes about 4 to 5 hours in between meals for that mechanism to be triggered. And if you're eating frequently, guess what's happening? Your body never gets this reset. So when you are fasting for 16 hours, you are giving your body such an amazing opportunity to keep your insulin level low, tap into those fat stores for energy, have greater cognition when you're awake, digestive rest, less bloating. You tap into this intrinsic process called autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process in the body. And so I think on so many levels, especially given our global situation right now, why not get rid of the disease disordered cells that we don't need? And autophagy is something that is potentiated when we are not eating. And so I think it's really, really helpful for people to understand just even the bare basics. Fasting is not a caloric restriction. People like to think it's all about the calories. And I remind people that's a very reductionist fixation on minutia. Our body recognizes food, macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. That is what our body recognizes. And when we are not eating, we are allowing our body to really, it's almost like we get a little tune-up every time we fast. And so on many, many levels, I just have come to find that when people are in a fasted state and they're creating these opportunities, like, this is my feeding window, they get very committed, as well as they get very committed to their goals, but they're also very intentional about their meals. Like, it becomes, okay, this is how I'm going to honor my body. I'm going to have this amazing steak and these non-starchy vegetables, and I'm going to have that at lunch. And then I'm not going to be hungry again until dinner time. They'll have another great meal. And then they're satiated. They sleep better. Their hormones are better balanced, men and women. But I think on many, many levels, we really do ourselves a disservice by telling our patients that we need to stoke our metabolism, that there's value in eating with frequency. In fact, I would argue against that is really one of many reasons why our health has really gotten derailed here in the United States.
Yeah, I would say I'm going to blame the zone on that.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to blame the zone diet.
Yeah.
And here's the effed up thing about that. And I've interviewed so many people on this, but I've talked to CJ Hunt, director of The Perfect Human Diet, and also the book, an investigative reporter. And he was like, yeah, but if you actually read all the fine print, the book that was really written about these swimmers and these athletes, they supplemented with fat. That diet that he told everyone to do, and he even said, this is not for everybody really. So, but then the world took it, and then it was, I've got to keep my insulin steady and eat every 2-3 hours. And you know what that does? At least, I don't know, in my opinion, it just makes you hypoglycemic almost, right?
Yeah. And that's actually the first sign of blood sugar dysregulation. Hypoglycemia is not benign. It is a sign that the communication tools between glucose and insulin are not working properly. Like when I was in nursing school a million years ago, we thought of hypoglycemia as just this benign mechanism. And I'm like, oh no, it's on a continuum, just like insulin resistance. It is a sign that the mechanisms with hormonal communication in the body are starting to dysregulate. So I look at that as something that's hugely problematic. And what's just incredibly ironic to me is that when I'm working with women and we start kind of investigating, how are you eating? What is your sleep like? What's your stress management like? 99.9% of the time, they all have blood sugar dysregulation, every single one of them, whether they're TOFI, which is thin on the outside, fat on the inside. They're obviously insulin resistant or they have diabetes. 99.9% of the time, they don't know how to fuel their bodies. So it's really starting from a very granular level, reteaching people, okay, to eat for satiety, this is what you need to do. You don't plate your food with a bunch of rice and a bunch of pasta and a bunch of bread. Now, my teenage boys might think differently, but they have metabolisms of hummingbirds. But when I talk to adults, I'm like, you've got to think about the protein first, got to hit those macros, think about non-starchy vegetables and, carbohydrates. I'm not anti-carb, but your carbs should come predominantly from low glycemic fruit, certainly from non-starchy vegetables first, and then cycling in carbohydrates, depending on how metabolically flexible you are. And since most people are not, that's one of the first things that gets pulled. And I don't know about you, Elle, but I think bread is like really challenging for women. Like that is the one pain point. Like when we start really talking about carbohydrates and processed carbs, I think people can give up a lot of the other things, but it is very, very challenging for them to give up bread. Like and I get it because bread is delicious, but if you want to stay on the straight and narrow.
Mark Sisson made this point many years ago. Bread, no one really has ever enjoyed bread completely by itself. I'm not saying a bite of sourdough by itself or French bread isn't good on its own. Yep. But no one usually just eats bread by itself. Right. What do they do with it? They sop it up with fat. That's the shit that makes everything taste good. Otherwise, it's all brown sludge, right? I find that it's really even not the bread. It's like once they do, they can't get rid of the oatmeal. The oatmeal. Oh, my
I don't
doctor
understand
said,
it.
oh, but the heart. Oh, but it's like, that's the one last grain people hold on to for some reason. Even the people that go, okay, I get the bread and pasta and I know that's not good. They go, no, but and what's funny is, my mom eats like a bowl of oatmeal every morning with fruit. And then finally, it's always great. And I'm sure it's the same with you, Cynthia. Like they hear it from someone else and they'll believe it. So I've been telling her about collagen forever. Finally, she tries collagen. And I said, well, just put it in your oatmeal. It's the easiest thing to do. Just throw it in there and just eat that every morning. And then she noticed that she was actually not hungry by her normal prescribed lunchtime a couple of hours later. Yeah. And I said, this is the whole point I've made about oatmeal and fruit as your first meal to begin with, which is, this is why that is. I want to dial back to something we were talking about, ketones, the brain and how people sense that clarity. Okay. So for all the people out there who may not even know about intermittent fasting, or even if you do, so let's say you just did go on a water fast for 3 days, or even the master cleanse or something like that. Over the years, what you hear from people is they're like, oh, it was tough. But then the third day, right? Oh, my brain lit up. And you and I both know why their brain lit up, right? It's because of the ketone. And so for everyone out there who's ever experienced that in the past, even if you did like a mild green juice fast or something, you would have by that third or fourth day, your body would have started to get, can you explain what happens in that moment? And then that kind of just says everything about it.
Well, and I think it goes back to, we have all this stored energy and we have to work through the stored energy. So while you're in this fasted state, whether it's a water fast, you're doing a modified type fast, you get to 24 hours. And I always feel like 24 to 48 for a lot of people is mentally the toughest. They get a little hungry, but they can work through it. They stay hydrated. And then, they get to this like 24, 48, 36 hour mark. And then all of a sudden their body has kind of worked through quite a bit of this stored energy. And so then they access these fat stores. And so these fatty acids are broken down into ketones. And when your ketones are up, all of a sudden people feel intrinsically so much better. And it's this beautiful sweet spot. Like that's when people say, oh, I could fast for a week. They may not want to fast that long, but they get to this point where they have this degree of mental clarity and it's this lowered insulin levels. You're burning through those ketones. Ketones are very efficient. All of a sudden people will say, I have that energy. Like, I feel like I could actually go to the gym. as opposed to, they think to themselves, okay, well, 5 years ago, I had to have a protein shake on the way to the gym and a protein shake after the gym. And then 2 hours later, I had to eat a meal. I mean, I used to be that person. I used to be convinced I had to. Yeah, exactly. It was disgusting. Like I think about how many protein shakes I drank in the morning just to try to get in all this protein that I was, convinced I had to have prior to exercise. And now I know better. But on that
note, let's talk about finish up what you're saying on the ketones, because then I got a muscle question.
Yeah, no. So I think in many, many ways, this is why you get people who can exercise in a fasted state, because they've gotten to a degree of metabolic flexibility where their body is really efficient at utilizing stored fats as a fuel source. And let me be very clear. A lot of people come to a ketogenic diet or a very low carb diet, and they think to themselves, okay, I have to have a lot of copious amounts of fat. And I just want people to think about the fact, I would rather burn stored fat in my body than eat copious amounts of fat. Like, I see people eating 3 avocados a day and 10 cups of nuts. I mean, I'm exaggerating, and a lot of cheese. And I'm like, these foods are not intrinsically unhealthy, but too much of any one thing. And fat is a very dense macronutrient. You have to be careful. And especially for women, because women get stuck on 2 things. They get stuck on nuts and cheese. And
everybody get rid of the cheese, except for occasionally. It's a fucking disaster. And nuts. So I remember when I first went paleo, and I didn't know what I was doing at first. And like, I think I was struggling a bit there in that first couple of weeks because I was still carbohydrate dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Mark and I was like, hey, what do I do? I don't know what I'm doing. And he's like, well, what are you reaching for if like you're having a moment? And I'm like, nuts. He's like, there you go. There's your problem. Because what people don't realize is that like a serving of nuts is a shot glass. And I don't know about you, but don't put pistachios in front of me and expect me to just shot a glass of nuts. Right. And so it becomes such a problem source. And then again, the visual, like you said, it's so nutrient dense that, a little piece of something equals a lot. And the other macros are different in terms of size with our eyes and portions. So yes, we see people make this mistake all the time when going keto or wanting to adopt a low carb, higher fat diet, adding too much fat. You've got fat on your body, you can burn too. And that's what Mark had said to me in that moment. He's like, you still need to burn the fat on your body. So if you are overeating the fat which he'd rather have you do than probably eat grains and, high carb, you still can get fat on a low carb diet.
Yes. And that's where people like, I love salted macadamia nuts.
Love that.
Like I have to literally get a 1/4 cup serving scooper, put it in the bag, put it in a bowl, put the nuts away. And that is my serving. And I'm not big on people having to measure their food constantly, but fats are a good thing to be conscientious about, because most women, I mean, let's be real, like most women, I find a lot of women don't digest their fats all that easily. They can have fat malabsorption. That's super, super common because I look at a lot of diagnostic testing, and I just tell people, I'm like, fats are wonderful. Like a salted macadamia nut, just thinking about it makes me happy. But I only have that a couple times a week because I know that if I sit in front of that open bag, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to eat more than a portion. And, I'm of the age and stage of my life where I have to be conscientious about those kinds of things, as much as it pains me to admit that. But, definitely cheese and nuts get a lot of people in trouble. And in fact, when I was, at the peak of perimenopause, when I finally went dairy free, I got rid of that 5 pounds, and I didn't even eat a lot of dairy. I mean, I ate like raw milk cheese occasionally, and occasionally I might have yogurt. And when I pulled both those things out, I was like, oh my God, it's the 5 pound dairy. So
it's the 5. Yeah. It's the 5. Really. Everybody try it. Also your skin. It's really, if anyone's having issues with skin, dairy, paleo, absolutely. Just paleo.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing.
I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier, where you're mentioning how the days of what a pain in the ass it was, and no one knew what to do. Like, okay, so I'm supposed to eat a banana before I work out, and then the shake within an hour, and should have this. And even if you're not hungry, and, it was like so confusing and stressful. And that paradigm makes sense when you're living in a world being a carbohydrate dependent sugar burner, which is what we're not talking about being, which is the bad thing that will lead to type 2 diabetes and lead to horrible accelerated aging. And so that makes sense. So the whole like, hey, you should probably eat protein within an hour of working out or whatever, that applies for a carb sugar burner. It doesn't apply. So if people are like, well, wait a minute, well, what if I'm working out? How can I fast? And I know you'll be able to describe sort of the science behind this better than me, but you don't have to worry about the catabolic nature. Only sugar burners really do.
Yeah. And I think if you think about it, again, we go back to, this 2018 study done by UNC School of Public Health, and they said 88.2% of the population is metabolically unhealthy. So if you think about it from that context, most people are not able to switch back and forth between burning carbs and burning fat. So most people are not in a position to be able to go long periods of time without eating. They're not in a position where they're, optimized to be able to exercise and tap into the ideal, pathway for fuel source, or even building good muscles, because their body is in fat storage mode. They're not looking to build muscle. Their body is building fat. They're just continuing to become more inflamed, more insulin resistant, likely be getting leptin resistance. And so that can be hugely problematic. So more often than not, people can really turn things around by just changing their meal frequency. Like, just don't eat snacks. Like, really, snacking is something that I think just begets the fact that your macros aren't put together properly. Like, my kids hate hearing that from me. They're like, I don't want to hear that. But when I'm home with them on the weekend and I can see what they ate for breakfast, what they had for lunch, what they had for dinner. And I'm like, you shouldn't be hungry at 10 o'clock in the morning if you had breakfast at 8. You just shouldn't be. If you didn't, you didn't have protein with your meal. And they just, scowl at me. So I'm like, eat more protein.
You're like, so I'm willing to throw a steak your way, but that's
exactly. I'm like, have another sausage, have more bacon, have some more eggs. Then you definitely won't be hungry for 4 hours. But yeah,
by the way, like, there's so many kids out there right now that would be like, oh, I wish you were my mom. I want to eat bacon, right? Then there's the other paradigm of people suggesting we stay away from it. Now, I know that you would suggest regenerative agriculture, grass-fed, pasture-raised. Of course, quality is important. Let's talk a little bit about how we get into this. If someone's a sugar burner, and of course, they can look at a paleo food list or go to your website and kind of get ideas of meal plans and things like that, how to clean out their cupboard maybe. But to get started where they're used to, eating in the morning, how do you steer away from that? Would it be a suggestion of like, hey, maybe for the first few days, have a little bit of like a little dab on the tongue of some MCT or a little fat to kind of hold you, like a little something less than like your normal meal? What's a little trick? Someone, first few days might be kind of tough for someone to wrap their head around this.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. I think the starting place that I come from is just to stop snacking. So if you're having 3 meals a day and you're snacking multiple times a day, you just stop snacking, and it will force you to examine what you are choosing to plate with your meals. And, step 2 is increase your protein intake. Now, you mentioned MCT oil, which is a really fantastic fat source that is broken down differently than a lot of other healthy fats are in the body. And that is definitely what I would call training wheels. Like, when people go from a standard American diet, couch potato and bravo, they want to pivot away from that, take away those snacks, sometimes a fatty coffee, when we're in a fasted state, bitter teas, black coffee, water with electrolytes, all super important to consume. But for some people, they're really struggling to get from 6 p.m. at night till even 9 a.m. in the morning. And that can be very helpful to have some MCT oil. I know that there are people out there who talk about butter coffees, and I can get really granular and talk about the fact that dairy is insulinemic. And so I think that I would rather they do a teaspoon, start small. When it comes to MCT oil, you don't want to end up having diarrhea, and we call it disaster pants. So I always say start low and slow. Like, I handle just a teaspoon of MCT oil, and then I have friends who can do tablespoons, plural. They can do a lot of it. I am not one of those people.
I'd have a blowout on that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tread lightly with MCT, everybody.
Yes.
But yeah, I agree with you. A little sippers.
Yeah.
As a training wheels is a good call. And then tell us about your book in this 45-day program. It is really targeted for women and to slow the aging process and to balance out the hormones. Now, you mentioned perimenopause and menopause. I mean, it ain't no joke. It's not. I'm in it now. I'm in the perimenopause phase. It's not a joke. And there are some things that can assist. Do you yourself do bioidentical hormone replacement?
That's a really good question. So yes, I do. I do not think I would have gone into menopause as early as I did, but in 2019, I was hospitalized for 13 days and lost 15 pounds. And so my working hypothesis, which is shared by my integrative medicine doc and my GYN, is that women in their perimenopause years, if they have like a divorce, a significant illness, et cetera, some type of trauma, they can hasten their transition into menopause. So I just in the past year started bioidenticals, and I think in many, many ways, it's a very kind of personal decision. For anyone that fears using hormone replacement therapy, I encourage you to read a book called Estrogen Matters by Dr. Bluming. I mean, he is an oncologist. The book is brilliant in many, many ways. I'm so excited to interview him on the podcast this spring. So right now I take oral progesterone. I was taking testosterone and estrogen, but it was a little more than what my body could process. So we took a break. I'm doing fine, but we had to take a break because I was having just nearly constant bleeding. And so I was like, okay, this is one of the trade-offs. When you make that transition, you're not supposed to bleed anymore. And I had months and months and months of that. So we kind of went back to square one. Progesterone helps me with sleep. Therefore, I am a huge proponent of progesterone. And for anyone that's listening that doesn't understand the role of progesterone, as we are transitioning, so north of 35, your ovaries are producing less progesterone. And progesterone is this kind of mellow hormone, helps reduce anxiety. It helps us sleep. It's kind of like the mellow hippie sister to estrogen. And as our ovaries are producing less progesterone, our adrenals have to pick up the slack. And that can manifest as weight gain, crime scene periods is what I used to affectionately refer them, poor quality sleep, your libido going down the toilet, all sorts of unpleasant things. And so, from my perspective, that's a good starting point. A lot of people would benefit from just oral progesterone or transdermal, which is skin absorbed progesterone therapy to kind of help with that transition as their beginning stages of perimenopause, latter stages of perimenopause. That's when estrogen is dropping. And that's when people can start with hot flashes and vaginal dryness and all sorts of, the genitourinary symptoms for a lot of women are not only kind of embarrassing, they don't want to talk about it, but really important for people to be having that open communication. So yeah, I am definitely pro hormones. And I think the research, I trained at Johns Hopkins at the time that the Women's Health Initiative study came out in 2002. And that's when women were just taken off of all of their hormone replacement therapy. And so my mother's generation, as one example, is the generation where we're starting to see the net impact of what happens when you don't have estradiol and testosterone and progesterone replaced, especially on brain health. So another great book is XX Brain by Dr. Lisa Mosconi. I'm not sure if you've read that. It's fascinating.
I will.
Really good book. But yeah, I'm definitely pro hormone. I know that there are a lot of opinions out there, but based on my research and certainly based on the fact that I want to reduce the likelihood I will become insulin resistant, because estrogen is an insulin sensitizing hormone. It's really, really important that, we're at least aware of what our options are. And so you can advocate for yourself.
It's almost such nature is so cruel in this way. I was like talking to my doctor. I'm like, why you turn a certain age and then the fucking world wants to just shut us down? Like the nature, it's tough. I am also pro it too. And it's so much safer, unlike it was in our parents' generation where they were given lots of things that were not bioidentical and caused even more problems. And then you also mentioned something that's really also the truth of all of this. This is really N equals 1 for each woman.
Correct.
So, and again, while I'm not an expert on this, I've had many conversations with my doctor, and testing isn't always the answer in terms of you could have high testosterone on a test and still need some. You can have low testosterone and have a high sex drive. You can, have a certain level of progesterone, but feel fine and not need it, or take it and it doesn't feel right. You have to feel it out. And unfortunately, there's no one I've ever spoken to who's gone through this. It didn't come with a lot of tinkering.
Yes, I would agree. In fact,
and so this is just why you have to get into it, right? It's why we as women, you have to learn, keep seeking, read all the books, do all the stuff with this subject, because you have to be a participant in it versus just having your doctor go, well, here's your blood work. And now, because I've seen that also go wrong with some of my friends in this phase too, where the doctor said, oh, well, you need progesterone. And it turns out actually they needed this. Right. But maybe the blood test doesn't show that,
Yeah. And I think, testosterone is grossly undertreated. And testosterone in women, we have less of it, but it's so much, it's very potent. And as an example, when I was being given testosterone and estrogen, what can happen is if you get too much testosterone on board, it can aromatize, it can turn into estrogen. So I suddenly became very estrogen dominant. I was like, whoa, this is not good. And yes, you can do testing and it can look good on paper and you can feel like crap, or, your testing may look terrible and you feel good. And I think that it's an N of one. Same thing with thyroid. I mean, this has really been your platform. And I tell women all the time, I mean, you could have 10 women with the same lab values and they might all need things a little differently. And I've been over medicated on thyroid medicine. And so I feel like there've been extremes. And so I have a healthy amount of respect for the endocrine system. I always say I bow at the temple. I never thought about the endocrine system, quite honestly. I was always like, why would anyone want to do endocrinology? That's boring. And now I'm like, I have a healthy amount of respect for my endocrine system. I never respected it enough until those perimenopause years, for sure.
Absolutely. So let's get into this 45-day air. I know it's, because listen, it's to relieve and alleviate everything we're talking about right now when it comes to this pain in the ass time. Or look, even if you're not in perimenopause and menopause and you're not worried about aging at this point, hey, get started now, because I know you and I, if we could go back in time, woulda, coulda, shoulda, we would have.
Oh my gosh, totally.
We would have read our own books. At age 20 or something. So this is the way to age gracefully and have your hormones optimized for life, if you're following what Cynthia is going to tell you. But so let's talk about this 45-day program without telling us every part of it. I mean, tell us, what can we expect from this, and what does that 45 days take us through?
Yeah. And that's a great question. So I have to tell you about my experimentation. So after that talk went viral, and all of a sudden, there was a lot of attention on people wanted to work with me. They wanted to learn how to fast. And so it became this experiment. What's the ideal time range to coach someone through intermittent fasting? We did 30 days, 45 days, 60 days. 60 days was too long. 30 was too short. 45 was just right. And so what I tell women will happen is that you will learn all of my best strategies. So I've been doing this for years. And specifically, this program has been fine-tuned over the last 3 years. You're going to learn all of my best practice strategies, and to do it in a way that's accessible, feasible, reasonable. There are challenges for people that are already fasting or feel ready for it. There are, I would say it's like dipping your toe in the pond. Some people are going to come to intermittent fasting and they're complete newbies. Maybe they have never in their entire lives gone more than 8 hours between meals. And so this will be a complete shakeup for them, all the way to people who've been doing this regularly and are just looking for a greater challenge. So it's comprised of, you get 45 days worth of content. Obviously, you get my whole story, you get a lot of explanation in a book. There's an amazing meal plan. There's this incredible chef, Beth Lipton, who wrote all the recipes. Obviously, I am very, I always say carnivore-ish, but I'm very pro animal-based protein, but there's also some vegetarian recipes. But we talk a lot about flavor. That's important to me, properly sourced meat, buying the best quality you can afford. There's seafood in there. There's all sorts of resources, my favorite products, the products I stand behind, companies that I like and I stand behind. And so on many, many levels, it's really giving you the blueprint to be successful. And it really starts as granular as, if you are a standard American diet eater and you are a couch potato, then you are going to remove those snacks. Then you're going to move into restructuring your macros to help stabilize your blood sugar. There's a whole week spent on prepping so that you're really ready to be able to hit the ground running, and then really giving people the support and resources that they need. I feel like I've read probably every book that's out there on fasting, and I really wanted to make sure it was a book that people could derive a lot of benefit from. I'm sure you probably feel the same way. There's a lot of books that are out there. You're like, okay, well, I just spent $20 on the book and I'm not sure I actually got any value out of it. But my intention when I was writing the book was for people to feel like they have me in their pocket, or they have me in their lap, that I'm literally there helping coach them through this process. Because my hope is that someone reads the book, takes action, and then they're able to change their lives forever. There's nothing more gratifying. And I'm sure you get these in your DMs probably every day. People that have read your books and it's changed their life. People that have watched a talk and it's changed their life. And so to me, not everyone has the ability to work with me personally, but they can certainly purchase the book and they can be able to kind of feel like they're working with me directly.
Well, and it's so nice to have the book too, to constantly refer back to, over and over again, when it's a sort of a manual and a step-by-step and all the detailed instruction you give. No, I know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's what a great contribution. I, let's talk. I want to also touch on, I guess we mentioned the anti-aging effects, but in autophagy, can you talk about though, like, I guess the way Mark Sisson describes it that I like is the whole analogy of like glucose is like a dirty burning fuel. and so it would be like throwing a bunch of kindling and newspapers into a fire. It'll burn bright and, crazy for a second, but then it just fizzles out, versus like an oak log that's going to burn steady and all day. Right. And so obviously everyone can get that analogy for brain fog and brain function and all of that. But can you just touch on like what glycation is and just this, like how it would affect like your skin and how you look and like that anti-aging too, not just the internal.
Yeah. And so glycation, for anyone who's listening and they're not familiar with that term, it's when we consume a lot of processed carbohydrates, a lot of sugar. It can actually, down on a cellular level, can change the quality of our cells. And so it seems very intangible. We use the term autophagy. What does that mean? Well, we're talking like at a cellular level, the things that can be changed, turned on. And that's why many times when you see someone that is very overweight or very obese, their skin can look almost shiny. And it's because they have all this glycation going on. And there's all this inflammation. That's the other piece. Like inflammation oftentimes begets fluid retention, which can, manifest as weight gain. I mean, there's so many manifestations of that, but glycation are these end products related to the breakdown of sugars. And so this is why, on many levels, I encourage people to limit or eliminate their processed food intake, get their carbohydrates from food-based sources, which is very, very different. The other piece is when our body is able to effectively break down and through mitophagy, which is the breakdown and recycling of diseased mitochondria. These are the powerhouses of our cells. Autophagy, which is the breakdown and recycling of specific types of proteins. This is an efficient way of our bodies running. So it is using up things that don't belong. It's getting rid of things that don't belong. And it doesn't exist in a state, where we're fed. So when you eat, you upregulate a process called mTOR. This is an oversimplification. When you're not eating, you accelerate autophagy. And so it's all about balance. Everything about the body is balance. And so I remind people that we would not have survived as a species if we were eating with frequency. And the reason why that would happen is there was food scarcity. There were not grocery stores. There were not mini marts. There were not, you couldn't order from Amazon and have something, or DoorDash, where something seemed to arrive instantaneously. So in this kind of hedonistic mindset and philosophy that most of us exist in, we are really dysregulating the intrinsic rhythms of our bodies. And so I like to remind people that we want to keep our blood sugar managed properly, want to keep our insulin levels low. We want to make sure that we're getting rid of disease, disordered cells. I remind people that when we have these disease and disordered cells circulating, it puts us at greater risk for certain types of cancers. It makes us more prone to inflammatory disorders and insulin resistance. And so on many, many levels, it's almost like you're taking out the garbage. Just like I tell people, you need to have a bowel movement.
And why, when you're eating, when you are not in autophagy, let's say, and you're eating, and the steak or the vegetables versus the sugar, like, I guess I wanted you to explain that, to hit that home about sugar. And actually even Jason Fung, and I forget exactly what the test is called, but right when let's say they know you have cancer, but they need to find out where it is in your body in third grade terms, they basically fill you up with glucose because the cancer cells will light up. Because they love sugar, quote, sugar, right? So so again, you might think you're getting away with burning the carbs. And this is where some athletes I've spoken to get into trouble, right? A lot of athletes are in insulin resistance, yet they look like the pillar of health in the mirror.
Right. Totally.
And so, it's like one of these things where you think you're getting away with it, but you're not, because on the back end, like your pancreas is pissed off or you're aging, you know what I mean? Right. Like your skin sucks, right. Or whatever it is. And so I just kind of wanted to hit that home about that. And then I guess I want to ask you about the carnivore-ish statement, claim you made, sort of how you live your life. So for you, what is that like? Is that just most of what you eat is predominantly meat?
I do eat quite a bit of meat. And this is just my happy place. This is my N of one. Certainly when I left the hospital 3 years ago, the only thing I tolerated for 9 months was meat, because my gut was just ravaged after 6 weeks of antifungals and antibiotics and, nearly dying from a ruptured appendix. And so it took such a long period of time. I genuinely missed vegetables. I've always been someone that enjoys vegetables. That was something I genuinely missed. But what I came to find out, the one thing I could eat that didn't upset my stomach was meat. And so I dreamt of burgers. The second week I was in the hospital, honest to God, I dreamt of a juicy, rare burger. It was hilarious. And so I ate a lot of meat. And what I came to find out of that was that my body really genuinely craves lean protein. Like, I'm never going to be a ribeye girl. I love a filet. I love salmon. I love tuna. I mean, I like bison steak. I just had bison. That was my last meal of the day. I had bison and cauliflower. Totally happy to eat that. But I think for so many people, they really have to find what works best for them. And so for me, I do best on a lower carb, higher protein diet. I wear a continuous glucose monitor, so I know exactly what my blood sugar is doing at any given point in time. And that has just worked well. I would say moderate fats. It really depends on, what else I'm eating. On a lower carb day, I might have a little larger portion of fat. On a higher carbohydrate day, I may have a smaller portion of fat. But
a great hack, by the way, a great hack
Yes.
right there that you just mentioned. Like,
Yep.
you're going to go carb it up. One time I did I knew I was going to have a piece of cake at this thing. And I was like, it's been a while. I'm just going to do it. So I was like, guess what? It's a steak and cake day. There's not going to be any other carbs, just cake. That cake is all that's going to happen over there other than this piece of meat. Sometimes you have to just gauge those things. And that's a good way to do it. Higher carb, maybe you watch the fat.
Yep. No, and I think it's definitely one of those circumstances that we're not talking about moderation, not like, we're not saying deprive yourself. It's the acknowledgement of, I know that if I'm going to have some dessert, I'm sure as heck not going to have the appetizer and the alcohol too. Just that doesn't serve me well. And it's not a hardship. Like, giving up alcohol during the pandemic has not been a big deal. Like, people are always shocked to hear that. I'm like, listen, it was the only thing that gave me hot flashes and disrupted my sleep. And I am very, 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 very committed to high quality sleep. Like, I wear an Oura ring. I'm all about the sleep hacks. And so it's really, exactly. That's why
I've got the Euler. I don't mess around. Yeah.
I have that too. Although it made too much noise, which is why I struggled with that a little bit, but I thought it was very cool. But I make my whole family freezes. We sleep at 65 degrees in our house. But then the thermostat's adjusted during the day. But I think on many, many levels that each one of us has to decide what nutritional program serves our best interests. And we have to be very honest. Like, I took out gluten when I turned 40 and I reversed an autoimmune issue. I took out grains at the time. I took out dairy. I don't miss them. I genuinely do not miss that stuff.
Yep.
And it's not a hardship for me. I actually just am very, very committed to feeling good and not having energy slumps and not feeling inflamed. And for me, probably my greatest vice in life is dark chocolate, but I don't eat a lot of it because sometimes it can be hard to regulate it. So I save it for specific times and then I put it away and I don't have it again for, another week. But I think for each one of us, we have to decide what serves us well. But most people don't eat enough protein. That's the honest truth, whether you're male or female. If you really look at the research about muscle protein synthesis and sarcopenia, which is this muscle loss with aging, I remind people that you really have to be aiming for at least 100 grams of protein a day, which means you have to eat a pretty good sized protein, portion.
No, very good point. I think sometimes you just kind of go through life, you don't even realize you're not eating enough protein sometimes. Yeah. I follow those same macros. I really thrive off of low carb, high protein and moderate fat, or even a little bit lower fat, depending sometimes.
Yep.
I love that. And also too, I think when people go down a keto road or a paleo road, there's lots of, again, like we talked, MCT oil products or coconut oil, this and that and the other. And that's great. And there's nothing wrong with saturated fat. You and I both would never say that that's bad. But I will say that one of the mistakes I made was having my fat intake being predominantly that type. And I had at one point had to go, hold on a minute. I need to vary this up. Where's the avocado? Where's the olive oil? You know what I mean? And I also realized that for me and my genetics, saturated fat was maybe not the best choice to be predominant, that should be the one that's the third on the list. And so these are just experiments you go through. But, fat is a tricky business. And I'm glad you really pointed that out, because a lot of people in this, it's like, oh, just eat all the fat you want and you're fine.
No.
And you might feel good though, if you're doing that on a low carb diet, but you're not going to reach a fitness or a fat burning goal.
Right.
Sure.
And I think that's an important distinction. I mean, for me personally, and just for full disclosure, I do better. This is the only time you'll ever hear me utter these words: plant-based fats, olives, olive oil, avocados, MCT oil. I do better with those lighter fats than I do with animal-based fats. And so I think you and I are on the same page about this. I have two people in my family that would like live and die for a ribeye. And my older son and I were like, we want the leaner meats. And that's just what my body gravitates towards. And there's no shame in it. Like, there was something on Twitter one day and all these people there eating these huge marbly meats. I was like, knock yourself out. That is the last thing I would gravitate towards. My body would hate me if I ate that. But it's really finding out what works best for you. See, my doodles are agreeing.
And so tell us, so we'll put everything in the show notes to connect with you, but give us your website, and also you're very active on social media and on Instagram.
Absolutely. So you can find my website, www.cynthiathurlow.com. You can do the pre-order for intermittent fasting. I have 45 right from there, or on Target, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I'm pretty active on Instagram. That appears to be my happy space. I kind of vacillated back and forth. I enjoyed Twitter for a long time. Right now, Twitter is like a dumpster fire. So, I know. But I am active. I also have an amazing podcast that Elle has been a part of. That is Everyday Wellness, where you can find me as well. But I'm kind of everywhere. I'm even on Facebook on occasion as well.
And you run great challenges and stuff throughout the year on Instagram, and have all sorts of things going on that people can participate in and start this process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I, for at least for now, if you get into my DMs, I'm actually the person answering them. I told my team, for as long as I can, I will be the person answering the DMs, as opposed to my team doing it, because I like to have the pulse of what people are curious and interested in.
I love that. I love that you're doing that, because you have so many followers, and it's nice that you didn't just pass it off quite yet.
Not yet. I mean, I'm going to do it for as long as possible. But, sometimes people are like, is this really you? Like, I've had people say that to me. I'm like, yes, this is really me.
Yeah. So you're really going to get Cynthia when you contact me. That's lovely. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom, for everything, for your podcast and this great book that's coming out here. Please, everyone, pre-order it, check it out. Anything you'd like to leave with our audience on this topic, or any topic?
Yeah, no, I would encourage everyone to check your fasting insulin levels. I think on many, many levels, people assume because their fasting glucose or hemoglobin A1C are normal, that they are therefore not at risk for developing insulin resistance. So my public PSA that I've been talking a lot about is check your fasting insulin. If your doctor or healthcare professional does not know how to interpret it, you can have it drawn. And normally what you want to see is that you want to see between 2 and 5. If it's greater than 8, then you really have work to be doing. And very likely along with that, you've got some degree of leptin resistance. But if you're struggling with weight loss resistance, asking for those labs, obviously Elle is an incredible resource for figuring out which thyroid labs you need to request for yourself. But definitely from a perspective of metabolic health, know what your fasting insulin levels is. It's super, super important.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us. And for everyone else, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Elle.
Hey listeners, over the years, a ton of companies have approached me to collaborate, but I will only promote companies whose products I believe in and that I actually use and consume on a regular basis. So let me tell you about some of my favorite companies that I can offer you discounts for. Rep Provisions, an amazing company doing incredible things for our planet, topsoil, and animals with regenerative agriculture. And it's my #1 source for quality pasture-raised meat and chicken. Visit repprovisions.com and use code L15 for 15% off. I'm also obsessed with a company called Carnivore Crisps. They make a lean, all-natural, and delicious alternative to conventional snacking, made with just real meat and real salt. Totally addictive, and my favorite ones are the beef brisket and the ribeye. Visit carnivorecrisps.com and use code PALEO10 for 10% off. I also love and regularly use Paleo Valley products. They make amazing supplements and delicious paleo products. I use the superfood greens powder, grass-fed beef sticks, the organ complex, and their bone broth bars. I love the lemon and apple. I also use their essential C complex and more. Visit paleovalley.com/promos/LRuss for 15% off. I also love Primal Kitchen. They make delicious paleo-approved, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and no refined sugar products. And I use them daily, from their collagen powders and sauces and marinades to their avocado and olive oil. So good, so healthy. Visit primalkitchen.com and use code L10 for 10% off. I also love paleo powder and use it almost on everything I cook. They make incredible seasoning blends, and they also have these incredible grain-free coatings that feel just like crispy breadings that you would have had prior to knowing that there's another way. So visit paleopowder.com and use code L15 for 15% off.